to today's meeting. It's hosted by Kate Osamore. Kate Osamore cannot be here, so she has sent her apologies to the meeting. My name's Steve Sweeney. I'll be chairing the meeting. I'm a journalist and I cover Turkish and Kurdish culture and politics. I've travelled extensively in Kurdistan. Most recently I was there in May this year, where I was detained on the border of Cizre as I went to meet the victims or families of the victims of the basement fires there. And I was held there and in an attempt to hide from the world what's happening in that part of Kurdistan. As we're running a bit late, I'm going to keep the opening actually very brief, just to say really that we've got some fantastic speakers. The meeting is organised and hosted by Kate Osamore, but also Peace in Kurdistan and the Centre for Kurdish Progress. For those of you that don't know, Peace in Kurdistan campaign is involved in a range of activities that aim to call attention to the human rights abuses suffered by the Kurdish people and connect those who are involved in the struggle for a genuine and lasting peace. Since it was launched in October 1994, the Peace in Kurdistan campaign has established itself as a vital and tireless campaigning organisation dedicated to advancing the rights of the Kurdish people and achieving a political resolution of the Kurdish question. It has a wide range of support of politicians, academics, lawyers, journalists and writers, including distinguished figures with international reputations, such as Professor Noam Chomsky, John Berger, Lady Antonia Fraser, Michael Holroyd, Margaret Drabble, Edward Bond, Edward Albee, the lawyer Gareth Pearce, Michael Mansfield QC, and the late playwrights Arthur Miller and Harold Pinter. The Centre for Kurdish Progress is an independent and non-partisan organisation established in June 2014, and it provides expert opinions and debates focusing on the issue of Kurdistan and Kurdish people in the UK as well as internationally. As a policy forum, Kurdish Progress organises speaker series, panel discussions and social events in order to progress the position of Kurdish people in the UK and to offer a space for debating Kurdistan's position in the world, which I think is very pertinent, particularly at this moment. Collaboration with the British Parliament, local and international think tanks and academic institutions frames the core principles of the Centre for Kurdish Progress, and its mission is very simple: to establish greater significance to the Kurdish question internationally and make society aware of the situation in the region and with the diaspora. We have a fantastic panel of speakers that are going to address the meeting today. Dr. Rada de Souza is a reader in law, specialising in international law and development, law in third world societies and resource conflicts in the third world. She is a social justice and civil liberties activist working in India, the UK and internationally, and she is the author of the preface to the book Abdullah Öcalan, Manifesto for a Democratic Civilization, Volume 2, Capitalism, The Age of Unmasked Gods and Naked Kings. We may have a copy for sale on the table here. If not, we do have a range of other books. Dr. Zeynep Kurban is a physicist working on renewable energy technology development at Imperial College London. And as a member of the Kurdish community living in the UK, she's been an activist within the Kurdish freedom movement from a very young age. Since the siege of Sinjar and Kobani in 2014, she has focused on aid activities throughout the region and with the charity Rebuild, which she is a co-founding member of, and the Hevasor Kurdistani, the Kurdish Red Crescent. She travelled to Rojava in 2015, soon after the liberation of Kobani. We have Dr. Thomas Jeffrey Miley, a lecturer in political sociology, Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. He received his BA from UCLA in 1995 and his PhD from Yale University in 2004. He has lectured at Yale University, Wesleyan University and St. Louis University of Madrid, and he has been a Garcia Pelayo Research Fellow at the Centre for Political and Constitutional Studies in Madrid. His research interests include comparative nationalisms and empirical democratic theory. His current project is on comparative struggles for self-determination in the 21st century, which obviously has a very clear and significant resonance for today. And he has published widely on dynamics of nationalist conflict and accommodation in Spain and increasingly in Turkey. And finally, to my left, Dimitri Rousopoulos is the chair of the Transnational Institution of Social Ecology and the president of the urban think tank Institute of Policy Alternatives Montreal. He has authored over a dozen books on subjects ranging from participatory democracy, social ecology and international politics, and as a publisher with Black Rose Books, he has published almost 500 books. He's a political and community organiser in many fields, including housing rights, the cooperative movement and ecological issues. He was a collaborator and friend of Murray Bookchin, the pioneer of social ecology, who has so inspired the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish movement. In February 2016 and February 2017, he participated in the international Imrani peace delegations organised by the EU-Turkey Civic Commission. Obviously, we're meeting in very interesting times and crucial times for the Kurdish movement and for the Kurdish people. We've witnessed the recent independence referendum in Iraq, and we've seen the recent action and activities where the Iraqi government have tried to take Kirkuk, following the results of that referendum. More recently, we've seen ISIS being driven out of Raqqa, and of course this means the future of Rojava and the democratic society that is being built there. The ideas around Rojava come very sharply into focus, and it is these ideas that the panel are going to discuss today. Each speaker will speak for around 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions, question and answer session. And I'm going to open by handing over to Brother D'Souza. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. And I'm sorry that we had to start late, but we were all here, and these are signs of the times we live in. I want to speak today and before you as a long-standing democratic rights movement activist in India, which I have been involved in. And I have been involved in the democratic rights movement in India, I think, throughout my adult years, going back to undergraduate years in university. And I want to emphasize that a democratic rights movement is not the same thing as parliamentary democracy. And that is something that one needs to keep in mind. So what I thought I will do today in the 10 minutes that I have is first just open up some general thoughts about democratic rights and freedoms, and then perhaps say something that may be relevant to the topic for today. One general observation, I want to begin by saying that democracy is not a fixed idea, that it's a constantly evolving, changing and expanding concept. And throughout the history of this concept, people have tried to widen the concept of democracy and infuse greater freedoms into that idea. Now, if we look at this place, the mother of parliaments, democracy begins here in England as a rights, a small group of landed aristocracy or landed gentry, if you like. And then from there we see the concept growing. There are merchants who come and say, we want rights, we want freedoms. But John Locke, who's the father or the patriarch of English democracy, if you like, did not want to include the vagabonds and the rabble, as he called them, in this whole concept of democracy. But of course the vagabonds and the rabbles of this country said, we too want this and we want to expand. The women came on board, the blacks, the slaves. So it's a concept that has gone on and expanded. And I think that is important to keep in mind, that it's not something fixed in time. It's not something that is written in stone, and it is something that keeps changing and evolving and expanding. But the key to this expansion
there are some seats down the front here as well, and the side.
there are two more seats at the front here.
One here.
The seats here, and down the side if people want to sit there.
Can everyone hear me at the back? Yeah? Not very well. All right, I'll stand up then. Is that better? So as I was saying, the concept of democracy is not something that is fixed. It is always evolving, and we infuse new meanings and more freedom. And that's the key nexus that I was coming to. But something quite extraordinary happened to European democracies during the World Wars and just after that. And that is that the whole idea of democracy as something that is limited to legal or formal processes was challenged by the socialist revolutions, which then said it's not just enough to have freedom of speech and expression. If a hungry man, what does that mean? What does right to property mean to a man who has no roof over his head, and so on? And that was the first time when democracy as freedoms of the privilege came to be seriously challenged. And that was a very qualitative shift. And then you have the anti-colonial movements, where, again, this whole concept of, what is this democracy? If it's going to exclude entire nations, if it's going to subjugate people, and if that is the price to pay. And so the anti-colonial movements challenged the whole idea of democracy and expanded it more and infused more new meanings to the whole idea of democracy. And then we have a whole new definition of democracy, saying from the anti-colonial movements that says democracy is about challenging imperial powers. That is the meaning of democracy. So you have, various third world national liberation leaders, and I won't go into that now. But from that expansion of meanings, I think that there is something, at least, that has become, it has tended to have a more fixed meaning. I will now go into the second part about the significance of this idea of democratic confederalism and Öcalan's own ideas about this and how I relate to it. Now, I want to emphasize that this is my response to these ideas as an Indian democratic rights activist and as somebody coming from a different context and a different situation. How does it speak to me, and what does it mean to me? Now, the first thing that I find about this, when I see this discourse of what is democracy, how can we expand it, and what new meanings can we infuse into that concept emerge, is that for the first time perhaps, after maybe the Chinese Revolution, maybe Vietnam, latest, we have somebody who has been in a struggle for over 40 years trying to re-theorize and reconceptualize the meaning of democracy. There are a lot of academics who have written a lot of stuff on that, and I'm not undermining any of that. But I think that there is a fundamental difference in the knowledge that scholars bring to the meanings of democracy, and people who have been in the struggle come out with new definitions and new meanings. And the main difference is academic knowledge is very fragmented. We are all into our disciplines. He does sociology, I do law, somebody else does something. So for us, democracy is rooted in a literature that others have written and within our specific different disciplines. But people who have come from active involvement in struggles bring insights, and therefore their insights from real life have the capacity to infuse new meanings into the old concepts of democracy, federalism, and so on, which we don't otherwise have. And we have not seen this happen for a very long time, since at least the Vietnam War. And this is the first time when there is a reformulation. And this alone is enough reason for us to take these ideas seriously and at least engage with them. I mean, I'm not saying, everyone has to accept whatever is said, but at least it is worthy of engagement because it is coming from realities on the ground and changes that are there, that are happening there. The second thing that I'm most interested, that I find interesting about this formulation of democratic confederalism is the way some of the old anti-colonial debates within anti-colonial movements are coming back. It resonates with so many of the early anti-colonial movements. At a time when all the contradictions of the world wars are coming back, we have all the mandate territories in trouble, we have all the kind of, the quarrels between the states of that time, Russia and United States and Britain and Turkey and all of that coming back again. It's very fascinating for me, who comes from those, as you know, the struggles in India were one of the most important ones during that time against the British Empire. And it's very interesting for me to see that the debates that went on within the Gadar movement in India in the early 20th century, within the Swadeshi movements in the early 20th century, they used the word democratic confederalism. They used the word, the terminology. And it's quite amazing to see the same language coming back after so many years. Because they talked about, we need to have a different kind of democracy for countries like in South Asia, where we are multilingual, multi-religious, multi-everything. It's an absolute tapestry of cultures and people and languages. And this kind of one-shoe-fits-all democracy is not going to work for us. We need to have what they call a confederation of nationalities, of diverse nationalities. And I find that extraordinary that it should come back from a man who I know has nothing to do with the Indian freedom struggle of the 20th century or the early 20th century. And lastly, for me, I think, the question that is raised in his ideas, if all states that have come to power in the name of freedom eventually turn into oppressors, what are we defending? Why are we defending? I mean, if that is, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that, and I'm not sure there is an easy answer to that. But I think it is a question worth asking. If, the European liberal democratic states, they became, at least for the people who come from the colonial world, we have seen the oppressive side of it. And it was very oppressive. People who said socialist freedoms, etc., and those states came, and that turned out to be what they turned out. Then, what is the state that we are trying to defend and create? And I think that's a very, very important question. And it is relevant not only for the Kurds. I'm thinking of the Kashmiris, I'm thinking of the Nagas, I'm thinking of the Tamils, I'm thinking of, so many other Baluchis. And this question needs to be addressed. And since the end of Second World War, all wars have been civil wars. There have been intra-state wars between ethnic groups, between religious groups, between local, things, where, of course, the big powers have played their part. And for this reason alone, it's extremely important to figure out why and what we are seeking to achieve. And I think those are the three things that I take away from this, and I think it's an important issue to engage with. As I said, it's not necessary we all agree with what everything says, but these are important issues to engage with. And with those words, I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much for that, and I thought it was very interesting to put it into the ideas of democratic confederalism into its international context as well, and I think that's something that's really important. I'm going to move swiftly on because again I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to hand over now to Thomas, who's going to speak again for 10 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rada. Thank you for those very stimulating comments. Begin the discussion. I too am very much impressed with Abdullah Öcalan's democratic and federal model, the articulation of an alternative understanding of self-determination, and crucially an alternative understanding of democracy against capitalism, democracy against the state. And I think this is something that, as an American citizen even, and as those of us from Europe as well, I think that actually we have a lot to learn from the Kurds. And so rather than us talking to the Kurds about what they need to do, I think we need to take heart and inspiration from this amazing feat of existential and intellectual courage on the part of Öcalan, but not just on Öcalan's part, but the Kurdish freedom movement more generally, which is in the middle of, at the very center of so many contradictions of this ongoing crisis of capitalist modernity, is forging a revolutionary alternative, and revolutionary imaginations, in fact, begin to be able to reconceptualize and rethink what an alternative to this ongoing disaster might look like and is and requires, in fact. So a few points about what I think are most significant about Öcalan's model and the Kurdish freedom movement. The first being that it is a response to the disaster of the nation-state. The disaster of the nation-state in the Middle East in particular, which cannot be forgotten, was a project imposed upon the region by the imperial powers at the end of the First World War with the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, and has been an unmitigated disaster for the region, but crucially for the Kurds. The Kurds who have been split along these borders, these imposed borders, and denied their rights, their cultural rights, denied the very recognition of their existence by a variety of nation-state projects. And so their emergence as an epicenter of resistance to that logic, I think, is world historic. in the first instance. And let me say as well, it's not just a model that is applicable to the Middle East or to people in other parts of the world, let's say outside of the so-called capitalist core, but it's a model and an alternative understanding of democracy that arises at a time when that liberal representative conception of democracy is very much in crisis. We see it in my country with the rise of Trump. We see it in this country with all the racist politics surrounding Brexit. We see it in Turkey, obviously, with Erdogan. We see it in India with Modi. We see this authoritarian militarist resurgence of militarism, resurgence of state nationalism, nation statism, so to speak, alongside the ongoing global crisis of neoliberal capitalism. So that's a second important point, which is that this democratic and federal alternative understanding of what self-determination and democracy could look like is something that we in the capitalist core need to really take very seriously. Yes. So the third point as well is linked to the fact that the Kurdish freedom movement, it's the contradictions that it is forced to struggle against are contradictions that speak very much to, very directly to the absurdity and comic book consciousness within which our leaders, our irresponsible leaders, are pushing humanity forward towards the precipice. What I'm referring to, this Orwellian war on terror. It's well known that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, but never has it been so surreal as for the Kurdish freedom movement, for the very same people, the people in this foreign policy establishment, the people in my foreign policy establishment of the United States, the very same actors, the very same movement, the Kurdish freedom movement, on one side of a border in Turkey are terrorists, on another side of a border in Syria are freedom fighters. So it really speaks to the absurd logic of this Orwellian war on terror, which is pushing us in an ever more militarist and ever more nationalist direction, and we need to really think about this. And I think the Kurdish form of resistance is something that is inspiring and a model for us. So let me just say a couple of things about what I think is significant for us in this parliament, given the fact that this parliament is part of the oppression of the Kurds in terms of the complicity with Turkey as the NATO partner and the ongoing human rights atrocities going on against Kurds in Iraq, in Turkey, in Syria, across the Middle East. But I think the Kurdish model, this Kurdish democratic and federal model, which is being built in Syria, is in fact, if the leaders of these countries were really concerned about stability and peace in the region, it is the only real roadmap for peace in the region. It's the only alternative to, it's a third way, let's say, between the two kinds of logics which my country, which this country pursue, which is either propping up tyrannical dictators or provoking state collapse through aggressive criminal wars of aggression. So this is a third alternative, which is a true kind of self-determination, a self-determination which I'll say a few things about what I think are the most important and admirable parts of it. But it's something that emerges out of, let's be clear about this in certain respects, the contradictions and atrocities of the fire that was set by these pyromaniacs, Tony Blair in this country, George Bush in the Middle East, and it continues to engulf the region in so many flames. But it's a model which, out of the contradictions and at the very epicenter of those human rights atrocities, is an alternative model for what democracy can mean. It's a model that puts gender emancipation at the forefront. It's a model that puts direct democracy and citizen participation at the forefront, and educational consciousness building of a citizen.
We can take back and some kind of hope. And I think certainly when we're sitting here in Parliament, that's something very, very important to think about when our government here were complicit in the imperialist carve-up in that part of the world a century ago, but they're continuing, their actions are continuing to create suffering particularly for the Kurdish people in that part of the world, with Theresa May selling arms to Turkey, and we know how they're used. I'm going to move on to our next speaker. We're going to take Dimitri now, who's going to speak again for 10 minutes, so I'll hand over to Dimitri.
Now listen carefully. What we have to recognize in this whole movement, new movement of ideas, it is very much generated by a universal genius. From time to time, we are lucky to live in periods where we recognize more and more the dimensions and the existence of a universal genius. And in my opinion, Abdul Öcalan is such a universal genius. His body of knowledge and his grasp of human history and human society is so extraordinary, so original, that it is shaking the very foundations of what we have been thinking and doing up until now, as a human civilization across the planet. And I'm not exaggerating, because I'm not known for exaggerating. The volume of writing that has to be not only read, but studied, is absolutely incredible. And what is particularly incredible is that he represents, in his thinking and in his action, a very fundamental rupture. A rupture. A rupture in the revolutionary tradition. A rupture with Marxism. A fundamental rupture with Marxism and Marxism-Leninism. And everything that history represented. You know, everybody in this room knows that this year is the 100th anniversary of the revolutions of 1917. And all of that agony, all of that uprising, all of that attempt to create a new society ended in 1989 with a fart. The whole bloody thing collapsed like a balloon. Incredible, unprecedented history, that an empire would just go whoosh. So Abdullah Öcalan comes along and he examines all of that and he said something has been flawed in the revolutionary project for a very long time, and I am going to tell the truth about it by doing all the necessary writing and historical research about it. So I want to emphasize the rupture that this very original figure represents. I'm not going to attempt in the few minutes that I have here to give you a highfalutin overview of what democratic confederalism is. Again, the writing is there, the articulation is very clear and very precise. But you know, there are many freedom movements all over the world. There are many people struggling to be free in a whole variety of ways. And I, who have been an activist for many, many decades, have been asked time and time again, well, why are you particularly concerned about the Kurds? Why not, for example, those people or those people or those people? Well, the reason why I became interested in the Kurdish cause is because of fundamental ideas. I began reading, something that I do very often indeed. I began reading, I began coming across this new form of understanding human society and human history. And interestingly enough, at a certain moment, I was invited to be part of a delegation to examine the human rights violations in Turkey against the Kurds, 2016. And I went again just recently this year in February 2017. And you know what was interesting about that experience? Talking to people, talking to Kurdish activists in various movements, be it trade unions, be it women's organizations, be it this or that, and so on and so forth. And actually being impressed in the long discussions that I had with them into the wee hours of the night, that they actually understood the theory. They understood the ideas. And not only did they understand them, but they were applying them. Concretely, we were asking for examples. Because at the basis of democratic confederalism is a complete restructuring of political, economic structures and social relations. That's what's at the core of it. Turning the whole thing on its head. And it is, of course, inspired by preceding major thinkers. To his credit. To his credit. And he has put together in this magnificent body of work ideas that, as Jeffrey mentioned, are to be found in both the philosophy of social ecology, Essays on Dialectical Naturalism by Murray Bookchin, recommended reading, and philosophy is one thing, but politics is also important. How do you apply it? So this is another major work on the politics of social ecology. And when you look down the contents of this book, what do you see under chapter 11? Confederalism. Confederalism, written decades ago. So there is an interesting cross-fertilization of major thinkers that is taking place, that is affecting social, political, and economic reality. Let me just conclude by saying to you that the very last days of our delegation in Istanbul of this year, the idea of producing a book based upon the experience of 2016 and 2017 especially, to produce a book of what we saw, the tragedy of what we saw inside of Turkey, and to put it in a historical context, and to say, well, how is this affecting what is going on in the so-called Middle East today? What is going on in Rojava, for instance? To see the application of these ideas. And that's what this book is all about. And it will come out soon. It's called Your Freedom of Mine. And you have that beautiful face on the cover, who's tragically confined as a solitary prison in that monster on Imrali, that little island of the Bosporus. And it's called Your Freedom and Mine. Abdul Öcalan and the Kurdish Question in Erdogan's Turkey. So let us join not only our hands in solidarity to fight for freedom, the freedom of the Kurdish people, but let's also join our minds together and think out these ideas and how we can apply them in our society. It's all very well to fight for the freedom of others, but dear, dear friends, we also have to fight for our freedom. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, and I think that was a pertinent point to end on, actually, in that particular speech, talking about our struggle for our freedom as well. It's very important, and I think, as Dimitri stressed, the body of work by from Abdullah Öcalan really is revolutionary, but we can only get to find out more about it by reading it. So those of you that haven't, I would take Dimitri's advice and read his work. I'm going to hand over now to Zainab, who's going to speak again for 10 minutes.
So, I don't really know how to follow on from that speech now. So that's why I'm going to start with a message from Nesrin Abdullah, the commander for YPJ and also the spokesperson for YPJ. I'm just going to read a quick paragraph, and I've printed this out for you to take away, and there are some available if you want some. So she starts off saying, humanity is experiencing serious crises around the world, both in the East and in the West. Symptoms of this crisis are seen in the Middle East. These crises take root from the lack of justice, lack of democracy, and when moral values of peoples have been stepped on. Ultimately, it divides the society in which women and children are most affected. The force leading the world, despite having the influence to carry out a solution, help to deepen these crises and yet cause new disasters in the name of political balances and capitalist interests. As a result of these politics, millions of people are displaced and millions have been killed. Again, women have paid the burden of this the most. So, it's the women have paid the burden the most, and in Syria and all across Kurdistan, really, women who are the ones who are really leading in the revolution that's taking place behind the ideas that we have just been discussing. And I think there's this prevailing consensus in the political left that there is a current crisis in the global democracy, and for instance with the EU's inability to combat the refugee crisis and the right-wing populism that's growing in the US and in Europe. We are seeing that the post-World War models are really failing. And again, it's to reiterate, really, the contemporary parliamentary democracy is only 100 years old. And this crisis that we're experiencing, both in terms of the politics, the economy, and the environment, which is an area that I work on specifically, has brought society to this crossroads. And people are now asking if this system needs to be reformed. And women are taking a central role in Syria today in actually leading the way, in answering the questions for how this system can be reformed. And the reason women are so empowered today is, again, thanks to Abdullah Öcalan, the person who Dimitri really well described as a genius, because he's seen very clearly that the enslavement of women are the ones for the last 5,000 years who have been enslaved in society, and they are the first slaves in history. And as a result, it is only through the liberation of women and the emancipation of women that society can be liberated. And this is really powerful because no other revolutionary movement had really put women at the forefront of the revolution. And it may be one of the main reasons for why the Kurdish people are so successful in the Middle East. And looking at the achievements of the YPJ, the armed forces, essentially, both in Manbij, in Kobane 3 years ago, and more recently in Raqqa, the liberation of these cities have essentially been devoted to the women, but also the women have been seen the central part of the liberation of these cities. In fact, when I went to Kobani in 2015 and spoke to some of the YPJ fighters, and they said it was really the will of the women that liberated Kobani. Because after 6 months of fighting, what is described as a war situation like mini Stalingrad, and just sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day with very little food, you need this extreme resilience that the women really had in that war to liberate Kobani, which has then enabled the successes of the Kurdish fighters in the region. So, just coming back to what is happening on the ground in terms of the activities of the women. The Kurds are really, so it is not just through the defense units, but what we talk less about, and which is actually what is happening very effectively in the region, is the establishment of the system, the democratic Confederalism model, with women taking a very central part in. And this is really led by this umbrella organization called the Congress-Star, which plays an active role in organizing women all across life, and they have these 10 committees that they have formed in which they organize women, and these are in the areas of education, culture and arts, economics, self-defense, social affairs, problem-solving and justice, politics, local government, ecology, press and media, and international relations. So women are being educated but also mobilized in all these areas within Syria, and it is not just the Kurdish women, of course, as you know. Assyrians have joined this movement, and Assyrian women. Arab women have been really in large numbers joining the movement. Like wherever the YPJ and YPG, well, the SDF forces go in the leadership of the Kurds, they have a lot of women joining the movement by seeing what they have to offer, but also this big idea that gives people such a sense of freedom, let's say, is really empowering women in the area to take a very active role in the defense, but also the society, the development of the society there. So just to cut it short, really just coming back to this idea of Öcalan, which is really, I had this quote that I found by an author called Simon Adams, who says, "It's weapons and technology may help win wars, but it's only ideas that have the power to truly change the world." And these ideas are really changing not just the Middle East and shaping the Middle East, but it's also inspiring people all over the world, the revolutionary movements, but the leftist, the political left essentially. And I really just want to ask the question about what we could do in Europe, and Nesrin Abdullah has a little bit on this in the message that we will be giving out. But I want to, in trying to answer this question about what we can do, I want to read a paragraph from my dear friend Mehmet Aksoy, who was recently martyred near Raqqa while working for the YPG press office. He says, "The Middle East is changing. Borders, mindsets, and demographics are in flux. There is chaos, a potential for change, whether positive or negative. The outcome will be determined by the quality of the struggle waged against regional and global reactionary forces, against ISIS and those like it, against the multinational companies wanting to expatriate the natural resources and the land of the people against imperialist governments who continue to try to suck the blood of the most fertile lands. And so, and Nesrin Abdullah also points out that 2017 will be the final year for both military and both military in terms of the military activities, but in politically as well. And she says if a solution is not reached, the conditions for a solution will be created this year. So we are expecting the so-called Geneva Peace Process Conference to be held again soon. And the Kurds have been left out of these negotiations in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's really run by the people who created the war in Syria, discussing the solution for the war in Syria. And it's really vitally important that we create pressure on our governments all over the world to make sure the Kurds have a voice on the table this time round, and make sure we create the sacrifices we have made, but also the idea, this grand idea that we are implementing, it's not just lost in the way that Dimitri pointed out in the case of the Soviet Union, which was much, much more expansive, of course. So another quote is that it's useless to send armies against ideas, and I think this is a really powerful one. So no matter what armies they send against us, if our ideas are big and if we spread it, they're not going to be able to win against us. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that was again another excellent presentation, which really stressed the role of women, not only in the thoughts of Abdullah Öcalan, but the role that they're playing in building, not only defending cities, but also in shaping and developing the new society. And I think it was a great theme, and it really is at the heart of Abdullah Öcalan's thinking.